At my engagement party, my future father-in-law slid a thick legal contract across the table. "Protect my son's money," he announced to a room of 50 wealthy guests. He believed I was a struggling freelancer desperate for a handout. I did not flinch. I did not shed a tear. I simply reached into my purse, retrieved my own leather-bound document, and slid it right back. He opened the folder, read the very first sentence, and his face turned the color of ash. He did not speak another word for the rest of the evening. The crystal chandeliers at Le Bernardin cast a warm glow over the private dining room, but the atmosphere at our table was freezing. I sat between my fiancé Julian and his father, Richard Harrison. Richard is a real estate tycoon who treats every interaction like a hostile takeover. We were supposed to be celebrating our engagement. Instead, Richard dropped a 60-page bound document right onto my dinner plate. The heavy thud made the silverware rattle. Conversations around the room died instantly. 50 high society guests turned their heads to watch. "Sign it right now," Richard commanded. His voice carried across the silent room, engineered to humiliate. "Julian is the heir to the Harrison real estate empire. We cannot have a freelance web designer walking into this family and walking away with half our legacy when you inevitably fail him." I felt the eyes of every guest crawling over my simple off-the-rack dress. The whispers started immediately. I heard the phrase "gold digger" hiss from a table nearby. I turned to look at Julian, expecting the man who proposed to me to defend our relationship. Instead, Julian kept his head down. He stared at his expensive watch and shifted away from me. He reached under the table, grabbing my wrist. His fingers dug sharply into my skin, squeezing hard enough to leave a mark. "Do not make a scene," Sloane Julian muttered through gritted teeth. "Just sign the paper. It is a standard procedure." His mother, Patricia, leaned across the table. She wore a diamond necklace that cost more than most houses and a sneer that looked permanently etched into her features. "We know your type, Sloane. You build cheap websites from some cramped Brooklyn apartment and think you hit the jackpot with my son. You are signing away any claim to spousal support, alimony, and property. You will leave this marriage with exactly what you brought into it. Nothing." Julian's older sister, Jessica, stood up from her seat. She picked up her glass of red wine and stepped behind my chair. With a flick of her wrist, she tipped the glass. The dark red liquid cascaded down the back of my dress, soaking through the fabric and pooling around my shoes. "Oh, my mistake," Jessica laughed, her tone dripping with venom. "But I suppose you are used to cleaning up messes, right?" The room erupted in cruel, scattered laughter. I looked across the table and locked eyes with Malik. Malik is Jessica's husband, a brilliant African-American senior auditor who spent the last 5 years enduring the Harrison family's quiet prejudice and relentless condescension. Malik did not laugh. He sat perfectly still, his dark eyes watching me with a silent, calculating intensity. He knew exactly what it felt like to be the target in this room. Julian tightened his grip on my bruised wrist. "I said sign it," he hissed. I carefully peeled Julian's fingers off my arm. I picked up a linen napkin, wiped a drop of wine from my collar, and looked directly at Richard. I spent my 20s crafting a very specific illusion. I drove a used car. I rented a tiny apartment. I told the Harrison family I was a struggling freelance designer because I wanted to know who Julian really was before I married him. They thought they held all the cards. They did not know that I am the founder and chief executive officer of DataSync, a tech firm valued at $120 million. "I understand, Richard," I said, keeping my voice steady and cold. "Protecting assets is a smart business move, so you will not mind reading my conditions." I reached into my bag and pulled out a sleek black folder. I slid it across the white tablecloth. It stopped right over the spilled wine. Richard snatched it up with a scoff. He flipped open the cover, ready to dismiss whatever he thought a freelancer could demand. "My name is Sloane. I am 29 years old. Before I tell you how I dismantled the Harrison family real estate empire, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you believe arrogant bullies always get what they deserve." The ink on the heavy legal paper was crisp, finalized by my corporate legal team just 48 hours prior. It sat under the glare of the crystal chandelier, a single sheet of paper designed to dismantle an entire hierarchy. I kept my hands folded neatly in my lap. I did not need to raise my voice or offer an explanation. The document spoke for itself. The first line was printed in bold, undeniable type. Appendix A. full inventory of assets belonging to Sloane Davis, Chief Executive Officer and majority shareholder of DataSync, valued at $120 million. Julian Harrison hereby waives any and all rights to this financial wealth. Richard's eyes traced the letters. He stopped breathing. The color drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly pale gray. His jaw slackened. The throat of this formidable real estate tycoon bobbed as he tried to swallow, but his vocal cords refused to work. He stared at the legal seal at the bottom of the page, a seal belonging to the most feared corporate litigation firm in Manhattan. This was not a bluff. This was a financial execution served on a silver platter in the middle of his own territory. Julian reached across his father and ripped the document from his hands. His eyes darted across the paragraphs. For 2 entire years I maintained a flawless disguise. I wore clearance rack sweaters and chipped nail polish. I lived in a walk-up apartment where the radiator clanked all night. I listened to Julian complain about the heavy burdens of managing his father's properties, nodding sympathetically while pouring cheap coffee. I told him I was a freelance web designer scraping by on small commissions. He loved that version of me. He loved feeling superior. He loved holding the power. In reality, while Julian slept, I managed a global workforce. I directed mergers. I scaled DataSync from a startup into a data infrastructure titan. I wanted to know if Julian loved me for my character or if he just enjoyed owning someone beneath his tax bracket. The disguise was my test. Julian failed. But as I watched Julian read the document, the quiet satisfaction of my reveal dissolved into cold, sharp confusion. Julian did not look angry. He did not look humiliated. He looked terrified. A sheen of cold sweat broke out across his forehead. His pupils dilated. His chest heaved as his breathing turned shallow and erratic. His knuckles turned bone white as he gripped the heavy cardstock. The paper rattled against his expensive silver cufflinks. He kept staring at the name of my company, DataSync. He stared at it like a man staring down the barrel of a loaded gun. Patricia could not endure the shift in power. Her husband was paralyzed. Her son was hyperventilating. The silence in the dining room threatened to suffocate her towering ego. She marched around the table, her designer heels striking the floor like a gavel. Her diamond bracelets clinked together as she snatched a crystal water goblet directly from my hand and hurled it downward. The glass shattered against the marble floor. Shards exploded outward, raining over my shoes and scraping against my bare ankles. Water splashed across the hem of my dress. "Are you bringing fake documents to extort this family?" Patricia hissed, her voice shaking with venom and desperate denial. "Do you think we are fools? Sloane, you print out some garbage from the internet, type up a fake valuation and expect us to bow down. You are a fraud. A cheap, manipulative fraud trying to steal our legacy. You disgust me." I did not raise my voice. I did not defend the paperwork. I simply looked at her. The truth does not require volume. The watermarks and notarized signatures on that paper were undeniable. Patricia knew it deep down, but her reality was fracturing and she needed an escape route. She grabbed her husband's arm. She grabbed her son's shoulder. "We are not entertaining this extortion," Patricia announced to the staring crowd, lifting her chin to project a false sense of authority. She dragged Richard and Julian away from the table, pulling them toward the private VIP lounge at the back of the restaurant. Julian stumbled as she pulled him, his legs barely supporting his weight. He did not look back at me. He kept his eyes glued to the floor, clutching my document against his chest like a shield. The heavy oak doors of the lounge slammed shut, sealing them inside. I stood alone in the center of the dining room. My dress was stained with red wine from the earlier incident. Fragments of broken glass surrounded my feet. 50 guests from New York's upper crust stared at me in deafening silence. No one stepped forward to help. No one offered a napkin. They watched with eager, predatory eyes, waiting to see if the supposed gold digger would crack under the humiliation and run away in tears. I maintained my posture. I kept my spine straight. I calmly reached down and picked up my purse from my chair. I did not let them see a single ounce of weakness. A man stepped out from the crowd. He was a cousin of Julian, a mid-level executive who drove leased sports cars to project an image of wealth he did not actually possess. He walked directly toward me, puffing out his chest. The overpowering scent of his cheap cologne hit me a second before he did. As he passed me, he dropped his shoulder and shoved me hard. The physical impact caught me off guard. My heels slipped on the spilled wine and the slick marble flooring. I stumbled backward, waving my arms to catch my balance. My hips slammed into the sharp edge of the dining table. The corner dug deep into my bone, sending a sharp spike of pain radiating down my leg. I gripped the tablecloth, steadying myself just before I hit the floor. Silverware clattered against plates. "Do not try to con the Harrisons, gold digger," the cousin muttered, his voice a low, hostile sneer, meant only for my ears. "Know your place and get out of here." I slowly stood up straight. I did not rub my bruised hip. I did not break eye contact. I looked him up and down, memorizing his features, filing his face away in my memory for the future. "I will remember that," I said quietly. My tone was flat, devoid of emotion, offering a promise rather than a threat. He scoffed, turning his back and disappearing into the murmuring crowd. I stood amidst the wreckage of my engagement dinner. My mind shifted into the cold, analytical state that built my company. I processed the data of the last 10 minutes. Richard's shock was logical. Patricia's desperate denial was logical. The cousin's physical aggression was a standard display of territorial dominance. They were arrogant people defending a crumbling hierarchy. But Julian's reaction was the anomaly. Julian did not react like an arrogant man whose ego had been bruised by a wealthy woman. He did not look angry that I had deceived him. He reacted like a man whose survival was suddenly on the line. I replayed the image of his face in my mind, the sweat, the erratic breathing, the sheer panic when he read the name Data Sync. I was not trembling because I had hidden my wealth. He was trembling because my wealth exposed a fatal vulnerability. He recognized the name of my company. He recognized it because it connected to something he had already done, something hidden, something desperate. My engagement was not just a lie. It was the cover for a crime, and I was about to find out exactly what kind of trap I had walked into. The heavy mahogany doors of the VIP lounge stood ajar. I needed my purse, which Julian had snatched from the dining table during his initial panic. I walked away from the whispering crowd in the main restaurant and stepped into the dim, soundproofed room. The door clicked shut behind me, severing the ambient noise of the party. The silence inside felt heavy, thick with a predatory tension. Before my eyes could adjust to the low light, a hand clamped down on my shoulder. Julian shoved me backward. My spine hit the textured wallpaper with a dull thud. His fingers tangled in the silk fabric of my collar, pulling the material tight across my throat. His face, usually a mask of rehearsed aristocratic charm, was contorted into a feral, desperate snarl. He reached out with his free hand, swiping a massive crystal vase off the decorative console table. It shattered against the hardwood floorboards. Jagged shards skipped across the Persian rug, resting near the tips of my shoes. "Are you trying to ruin me?" Julian roared. His breath smelled of stale champagne and raw panic. His grip tightened, pressing my shoulder blades hard into the wall. "Sign my father's contract right now. You will sign it, or I swear I will ruin your entire life. I will post the video of you sleeping with another man on every corner of the internet." I stared at the man I almost married. His tailored suit jacket was rumpled. A bead of sweat dripped down his temple. He looked nothing like a confident heir. He looked like a cornered animal. "What video?" I asked. My voice remained remarkably level, showing no trace of fear. Julian pulled his smartphone from his suit pocket. He shoved the glowing screen inches from my face and pressed play. The footage showed a dimly lit hotel room. A woman with my face and my hair was tangled in the bedsheets with a man I had never seen before. The audio played sickening, muffled gasps. The visual mapping was exquisite. The skin tones matched my complexion, the shadow rendering aligned with the artificial light in the digital room. The synchronization of the lips moving was crafted with high-end processing power. A lesser person would have crumbled. A normal bride would have collapsed in tears, terrified of the public humiliation. But I am a tech executive. I build data structures, artificial intelligence safeguards, and digital infrastructure for a living. I did not feel fear. I felt a cold, clinical curiosity. I analyzed the footage the way a surgeon examines a scan. I recognized the slight pixelation around the jawline. I noticed the unnatural lack of blinking in the generated eyes. I saw the digital artifacts blurring the edges of the hair where the synthetic face met the original actor's head. It was a deepfake. An expensive, high-grade deepfake, but a fake nonetheless. This family values honor above all else. Patricia stepped out from the shadows near the leather seating area. She smoothed the front of her designer dress. She looked at me with the detached gaze of a butcher inspecting livestock. We cannot have a disgraced woman dragging the Harrison name through the mud. I kept my eyes on Julian's trembling hand holding the phone. Patricia continued her calculated monologue, pacing slowly across the room. You will sign a revised version of the prenuptial agreement. You will leave this relationship empty-handed. Furthermore, you will transfer voting control and majority shares of your little tech company to Julian. We will frame it as compensation for the severe reputational damage you have caused this family. If you refuse, every investor, every vendor, and every board member associated with DataSync will receive this video tomorrow morning. Your career will turn to ash. We will destroy your credibility in the tech industry before lunchtime. The puzzle pieces snapped into a vivid, horrifying picture. The Harrisons did not invite me into their family out of charity. They did not push for a rapid engagement because Julian was blinded by love. They knew everything. They had run a stealth background check months ago. They discovered that the struggling freelance designer was actually the majority shareholder of a 9-figure enterprise. They played along with my poor disguise because it gave them the perfect leverage. They planned to use an airtight, draconian prenuptial agreement to corner me. And when I revealed the true scale of my assets at the dinner table, throwing off their initial strategy, they deployed their backup plan. This extortion was not about protecting the Harrison family wealth. It was about stealing mine. I looked at Richard, who stood silently in the corner, clutching his chest as he recovered from his earlier shock. I looked at Patricia, clinging to her fading socialite status with desperate aggression. I looked at Julian, a weak boy trying to play the role of a ruthless predator. My mind connected the financial dots. Real estate is an illiquid asset. The market was currently experiencing a severe downturn. The Harrison empire was likely bleeding cash, trapped beneath a mountain of debt, unable to liquidate their high-rise properties to pay off their creditors. DataSync, on the other hand, generated massive liquid revenue. I was a walking cash cow. They were not defending an empire. They were drowning. Only a bankrupt, desperate syndicate would resort to fabricating digital pornography to steal equity from a future daughter-in-law. Julian pressed his forearm against my collarbone, leaning his weight into me. Well, he spat, his eyes wide and frantic. Are you ready to sign? I did not scream. I did not shed a single tear. I let a slow, freezing smile spread across my face. I raised my hand and gripped Julian's wrist. I expected resistance, but he did not expect technique. I dug my nails directly into his pulse point, twisting his arm downward with a sudden, sharp torque. The unexpected leverage broke his grip instantly. He gasped in pain and stumbled backward, dropping his phone onto the carpet. I stepped away from the wall. I smoothed the lapels of my stained dress, restoring my posture to perfect symmetry. I looked down at the glowing screen of the phone lying on the rug, then shifted my gaze to the 3 people standing in the room. You spent a fortune generating a fake video to steal my company, I said softly. My voice echoed in the quiet room, carrying the steady, unyielding weight of a judge delivering a sentence. You hired a digital forensics team to map my face, hoping to force a transfer of my shares because your real estate portfolio is underwater. Patricia's mouth fell open. Richard took a step back, hitting the edge of a mahogany side table. Julian rubbed his wrist, staring at me in sheer horror as I dismantled their entire conspiracy in a few sentences. But you failed to understand one crucial detail. I continued, my tone dropping to a lethal whisper. You are blackmailing the wrong person. I stepped over the shattered crystal vase. I walked to the leather sofa, retrieved my purse, and turned toward the exit. I did not run. I walked with measured, deliberate steps. I did not look back as I opened the heavy oak doors, leaving the Harrison family trapped in a prison of their own making. I stepped back out into the bustling hallway of the restaurant, preparing to leave this nightmare behind. I did not know that the true danger was waiting for me just outside those doors. I walked out of the heavy mahogany doors into the carpeted corridor of the restaurant. The ambient noise of the main dining room washed over me. Waiters in crisp white uniforms glided past, carrying silver trays of champagne. The string quartet played a soft, classical melody in the background. I had just dismantled Julian's cheap blackmail attempt inside that VIP lounge, but the puzzle still felt incomplete in my mind. The deepfake video was a clumsy, desperate tool. The Harrisons were rushing the timeline. They were demanding my signature tonight, pushing, with a frantic, uncoordinated aggression that did not match the behavior of wealthy investors protecting a portfolio. They were acting like people running out of time. As I passed the swinging metal doors of the kitchen service entrance, a strong hand clamped around my wrist. It was not a bruising territorial grip like Julian's. It was firm, precise, and urgent. A sudden tug pulled me out of the bright corridor and into the harsh, fluorescent glare of the staff service hallway. I raised my free arm to defend myself, preparing to strike, but a familiar voice cut through the mechanical hum of the industrial refrigerators. "Do not strike, Sloane," the voice whispered. "We have very little time." It was Malik. He stood backed against the concrete wall, his dark eyes scanning the corridor behind me to ensure no one had followed. Malik is Jessica's husband. He is a senior corporate auditor, a brilliant African-American man who fought his way up from a working-class neighborhood in Queens to the top floors of a major accounting firm. For 5 years, I watched Malik sit at the Harrison dining table. I watched him swallow their subtle, elitist insults. I watched Richard make disparaging jokes about Malik's background while Malik quietly cut his steak. Malik never raised his voice. He played the quiet, agreeable son-in-law, absorbing their prejudice with a blank expression. But looking at his sharp, calculating posture right now, I realized Malik was not submissive. He was a predator in waiting. He had spent half a decade studying his captors. "Do not go back to your apartment tonight," Malik said. His voice was a low, steady current of urgency. He reached into the inside pocket of his tailored suit jacket and pressed a cold metal object into the palm of my hand. I looked down. It was a high-capacity, encrypted USB drive. The metal casing felt freezing against my skin. I looked back up at his face. "What is this?" I asked. Malik shook his head, keeping his body positioned to block me from the view of the main hallway. "Julian is not just trying to steal your shares with a fabricated video. That deepfake is a desperate backup plan. It is a smokescreen. Julian stole your personal identification 3 months ago. He used your engagement as a cover. While you slept, he accessed your personal laptop. He copied your social security number, your digital signature keys, and the corporate registration numbers for data sync." I felt the ambient chill of the service hallway seep into my bones. Identity theft on that scale requires a specific, massive motive. You do not steal a chief executive officer's digital credentials just to draft a favorable prenuptial agreement. Richard's real estate holding company is dead. Malik explained the words, spilling out in a rapid, clinical cadence. The commercial properties are vacant. The banks cut off their credit lines last quarter. They were facing immediate foreclosure across their entire portfolio. Julian panicked. He realized the inheritance was vaporizing. He bypassed the traditional lenders and reached out to a shadow lending syndicate operating out of the Diamond District. These are not bankers, Sloane. They are ruthless operators who liquidate assets through force. They break bones and seize infrastructure when they do not get paid. My analytical mind raced, connecting the financial data points. How much did he borrow? $15 million, Malik answered. His jaw tightened. But an underground syndicate does not hand over $15 million in liquid cash without solid collateral. Julian forged a series of corporate guarantees. I used your stolen credentials to pledge data sync as the collateral for the shadow loan. He created a shell holding company, naming himself as a proxy director. He presented your tech empire to the syndicate, telling them he held a controlling interest in your business. The scale of Julian's betrayal expanded far beyond a simple extortion attempt. Julian had weaponized my life's work to finance his father's failing empire. He had effectively co-signed a mafia loan using my digital identity. He tied my physical safety to a $15 million debt I knew nothing about. "Why are they demanding my signature tonight?" I asked, my voice remaining remarkably steady, despite the escalating lethal threat. "Because the loan matures tomorrow at noon," Malik said, checking the hallway again. "The syndicate requires full repayment, or they take the collateral. Julian knows the creditors will audit the paperwork tomorrow morning. If they discover his collateral documents are forged, they will kill him. He needs you to sign that transfer of equity tonight to make his forged documents legitimate. He is trying to retroactively cover his tracks before the syndicate realizes they hold fake paper. And if I refuse to sign?" I asked. Malik looked at me with a grim, chilling certainty. "If you do not sign, they will tell the syndicate that you orchestrated the loan. They will hand over your home address, your office layout, and your daily schedule. They are planning to throw you to the wolves to save their own skin. Julian will claim you embezzled the money and fled. They will let the syndicate hunt you down while they escape with the remaining cash. The parameters of the war had shifted. Julian was no longer just a manipulative ex-fiancé. He was a desperate criminal who had sold my life to an underground syndicate. "Why are you giving this to me?" I asked, holding up the cold metal drive. "You are married to his sister. You are a member of this family." Malik let out a dry, humorless scoff. "I am a prop to them, a diversity token for their country club galas. For 5 years, I audited Richard's books in secret. I tracked every shell company, every offshore account, every bribe he paid to city inspectors. I watched them bleed innocent contractors dry and laugh about it over expensive wine. When I saw Julian targeting you, I knew you were their final exit strategy. That drive contains the digital footprint of the forged loan application. It contains the IP addresses Julian used to contact the syndicate. It is the only proof that you had no part in this transaction." I closed my hand around the drive. The jagged edges of the metal pressed deep into my skin. This was not just a broken engagement. This was a fight for my physical survival. Julian had placed a $15 million bounty on my head. "I owe you, Malik," I said. "You owe me nothing," Malik replied, adjusting his silk tie to ensure it lay perfectly flat. "Just burn their empire to the ground. That will be payment enough." Suddenly, the sharp, rhythmic clicking of stiletto heels echoed from the main corridor. The sound bounced off the tiled walls, growing louder and faster. Someone was approaching the service entrance. Malik's posture shifted instantly. The sharp, calculating auditor vanished. The quiet, passive son-in-law returned. His shoulders slouched slightly. His facial expression went entirely blank, slipping back into the submissive mask he wore for the Harrisons. "Go through the kitchen," Malik ordered, turning his back to me and lowering his voice. "Exit through the loading dock. Do not go back to your apartment. They already gave your address to the collectors." Before I could say another word, the heavy service door swung open. Jessica stood in the doorway. Her designer gown shimmered under the harsh fluorescent lights. Her eyes darted between Malik and me. Her mouth curled into a suspicious, aggressive sneer. "What are you doing back here?" Jessica demanded, her voice echoing in the narrow concrete space. "Are you fraternizing with the help, Malik? Or are you conspiring with the gold digger?" Malik did not flinch. He looked at his wife with a dull, vacant expression. "I was just asking her to leave Jessica. She was causing a disturbance in the hallway. I did not want her ruining the rest of the evening." Jessica scoffed, stepping closer. She pointed a manicured finger directly at my chest. "You are lucky my brother is too kind-hearted to call the police on you for trespassing. Get out of our sight. You are finished in this city. Your little freelance career is over." I looked at Jessica. She stood there radiating arrogant entitlement, entirely unaware that her family's wealth was built on quicksand and criminal debt. I did not respond to her insult. I simply tightened my grip on the USB drive hidden inside my coat pocket. I turned away from the Harrison siblings. I pushed through the swinging double doors leading into the bustling restaurant kitchen. The intense heat of the industrial stoves and the shouting of the line cooks enveloped me. I moved fast, dodging waiters balancing silver trays and busboys pushing heavy carts. My heels clicked against the grease-stained floor tiles as I navigated the chaotic maze of stainless steel prep stations. I reached the heavy metal exit door at the back of the kitchen. I pushed the emergency bar and stepped out into the damp, freezing alleyway of the loading dock. The heavy door slammed shut behind me, cutting off the noise of the restaurant. The alley smelled of rotting garbage and wet asphalt. I stood alone in the dark. The cold night air bit through my thin silk dress, but I did not shiver. I clutched the digital weapon Malik gave me. The debt was due tomorrow. I had less than 12 hours before a crew of ruthless debt collectors arrived at my doorstep looking for $15 million. I needed a secure location, and I needed my corporate legal team. I pulled my phone from my purse and dialed an encrypted line. I navigated the maze of dumpsters and stacked wooden pallets in the alleyway behind the restaurant. The damp night air bit at my exposed shoulders, but my focus remained locked on my black SUV parked under a flickering street lamp. I unlocked the vehicle, remotely pulled the heavy door open, and climbed into the driver's seat. The locking mechanism engaged with a solid, reassuring click. I was sealed inside a steel vault, temporarily isolated from the immediate physical threats of the Harrison family. I reached into the back seat, unzipped my leather briefcase, and pulled out my laptop. The screen booted up, casting a harsh blue glow across the steering wheel and illuminating the dark cabin. I retrieved the metal flash drive Malik had pressed into my palm. I inserted it into the port. A password prompt flashed across the screen. Malik was an auditor. He built logical walls. I typed in the date of his wedding anniversary, the day he legally bound himself to the Harrison empire. The encryption barrier dissolved. Rows of financial spreadsheets, offshore bank routing numbers, and scanned legal contracts populated my screen. I did not just read the documents. I performed a digital autopsy. I opened the primary loan agreement. The header displayed the insignia of a shadow lending firm operating out of a shell corporation in Cyprus. The principal amount read $15 million. Below the payment schedule, my own digital signature sat stamped on the guarantor line. Julian had stolen my private cryptographic key. He bypassed my two-factor authentication by mirroring my primary device during a weekend getaway to the Hamptons. He used my credentials to pledge my entire data infrastructure as collateral. But the forged loan was only the surface wound. I dug deeper into the file directories. I opened a subfolder labeled Data Sync Routing. The blood ran cold in my veins. Julian did not just borrow money against my company. He used my proprietary software network to launder dirty cash for his father's real estate firm. The Harrisons were drowning in debt, unable to pay their legitimate creditors. To keep their construction sites operational, Richard and Julian funneled illicit funds from the syndicate through DataSync's server farm. They created phantom vendor accounts masking the syndicate's money as payment for data storage services. The clean money was then wired directly into the Harrison holding accounts. Julian had turned my life's work into a washing machine for organized crime. By routing the transactions through my administrative access portals, he ensured the digital footprint traced back to my office, not his. He manufactured a paper trail that framed me as the mastermind of a federal financial crime. If the Securities and Exchange Commission or the Federal Bureau of Investigation audited these servers, the Harrison family would play the victim. They would point the finger at the greedy tech executive who infiltrated their family to hide her criminal enterprise. They engineered a perfect scapegoat. A sudden, deafening crack shattered the silence of the alleyway. The reinforced glass of my driver's side window bowed inward under the force of a heavy impact. I flinched, dropping the laptop onto the passenger seat. Two men stood outside my vehicle. They did not look like the valet staff or the polished guests from the engagement party. They wore dark, ill-fitting suits that stretched tightly across heavy, muscular frames. The street lamp illuminated thick, jagged tattoos crawling up their necks and disappearing behind their collars. The taller man held a solid steel tire iron. He raised the metal bar and tapped it gently against the fractured glass of my window, offering a polite but lethal warning. He leaned down, bringing his face inches from the glass. I did not scream. I did not scramble for the ignition. I sat perfectly still, maintaining eye contact through the spiderweb cracks in the window. The man smiled. It was a cold, empty expression. "Ms. Davis," the man said, his voice muffled but entirely audible through the damaged glass. "Our boss sends his regards. The $15 million balance matures tomorrow at noon. We do not grant extensions. You deliver the capital or your little tech company turns to ash." The second man stepped into the light. He carried a red plastic gasoline canister. He hoisted the container and tossed it onto the hood of my SUV. The hollow plastic clattered against the metal chassis and rolled toward the windshield, coming to a rest against the wiper blades. The scent of raw fuel leaked through the ventilation system, filling the cabin with a suffocating metallic odor. "We will see you tomorrow, Sloane," the first man whispered. They turned their backs and walked down the alley, dissolving into the shadows, without checking to see if I was watching. I sat in the driver's seat, breathing in the toxic fumes. My heart pounded against my ribs in a steady, aggressive rhythm. The conflict had escalated beyond arrogant insults at a dinner table. My physical safety, my freedom, and the company I built from nothing were pinned against a wall. The natural instinct of any ordinary citizen would be to dial emergency services. I reached for my phone, but my thumb hovered over the keypad. I stopped. The police could not help me. If law enforcement initiated an investigation, they would seize my servers. The detectives would uncover the forged paper trail Julian manufactured. The federal authorities would arrest me for money laundering before they ever touched the Harrison family. Calling the authorities meant walking directly into Julian's trap. I needed a different kind of weapon. I opened my contacts and dialed a private number. The line rang twice before a sharp alert voice answered. It was Victor Reed, the chief legal officer of Data Sync. Victor was a former federal prosecutor who left the government sector to protect corporate empires. He was ruthless, brilliant, and fiercely loyal to the company we built together. Sloane Victor said, his tone shifting into immediate professional focus upon hearing the silence on my end. "It is late. Is there a breach?" "There is a breach, Victor," I replied, my voice steady, devoid of the panic the syndicate men expected to leave behind. "I need you to mobilize the entire crisis management team. Bring the forensic accountants and the cybersecurity directors to the secure boardroom in 30 minutes. Victor did not ask for a summary. He did not ask if it could wait until morning. He recognized the specific cadence of my voice. Understood. "What is the target?" "The target is Richard and Julian Harrison," I stated. I shifted the car into reverse and tapped the gas pedal. The sudden movement sent the empty gasoline canister sliding off my hood. It bounced harmlessly onto the wet asphalt. Julian used my digital signature to collateralize a shadow loan. He routed illicit funds through our network to keep his father's real estate firm afloat. The debt matures at noon tomorrow, and the syndicate just threatened to burn our infrastructure to the ground if I do not pay his $15 million tab. I shifted the SUV into drive, my headlights piercing the darkness of the alleyway. "Victor, we are not going to pay them. We are going to sever the Harrison family's access to their own money, and we are going to hand them over to the wolves they invited to the door. Prepare the digital locks." The morning light filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my corporate boardroom, illuminating the exhaustion on the faces of my legal and cybersecurity teams. We had spent the entire night analyzing Malik's encrypted drive and fortifying our digital perimeter. At exactly 8 o'clock, my personal phone buzzed against the polished mahogany table. The screen lit up with a text message from Richard Harrison. The notification sat there like a digital command demanding obedience. "Tonight, 7 o'clock, family dinner at the Harrison estate. Bring the contract and a pen. Do not make things worse for yourself." The sheer arrogance of the message was remarkable. He believed the threat from the syndicate's enforcers the previous night had successfully broken my spirit. He assumed the image of a gasoline canister on my hood would terrorize me into submission. I did not reply to his text. I simply locked my screen, dismissed my team to execute the defensive protocols we had drafted, and went home to prepare my armor. I arrived at the Harrison estate precisely at 7. The sprawling mansion sat behind heavy iron gates in an exclusive enclave of Westchester County. It projected an image of generational wealth and untouchable power, an illusion I now knew was financed by shadow loans and digital forgery. I stepped out of my vehicle wearing a charcoal gray tailored power suit. The sharp lines of the blazer and the immaculate tailoring served as a physical boundary. I was not arriving as a frightened bride. I was arriving as a chief executive officer attending a hostile negotiation. The heavy oak door opened before I could knock. A silent housekeeper led me into the formal dining room. The atmosphere was thick with predatory anticipation. The entire Harrison family sat around the massive antique table, waiting like vultures preparing to pick clean a carcass. Richard sat at the head of the table, his posture rigid and authoritative. Patricia sat to his right, wearing a self-satisfied, victorious smirk. Julian occupied the seat to his left, avoiding my gaze and staring intently at his empty plate. Malik was notably absent from the table, a strategic absence I understood immediately. Jessica stood near the ornate marble fireplace, holding a full glass of dark red wine. She watched me walk into the room, her eyes trailing over my expensive suit with unconcealed jealousy. She took a step forward, timing her movement to intercept my path as I approached the empty chair designated for me. As our shoulders aligned, Jessica tilted her wrist. She did not stumble. She did not pretend to trip. She deliberately launched the contents of her glass directly at my chest. The crimson liquid splashed across the crisp white silk of my blouse, soaking the fabric and bleeding into the charcoal lapel of my blazer. Drops of wine splattered against my jawline and dripped onto the floor. "Oh, my apologies," Jessica said, her voice laced with mock sympathy and a cruel, jagged edge. I assumed you were already accustomed to being filthy, considering the mess you dragged into this family." The dining room erupted into a chorus of cold, synchronized laughter. Patricia chuckled softly, raising her water glass to her lips. Richard offered a low, approving scoff. Julian managed a weak, nervous smile, desperate to align himself with his sister's aggression. The public humiliation was a calculated tactic designed to strip away my dignity before the financial demands were made. They wanted me to feel small, stained, and powerless. I did not gasp. I did not grab a napkin to furiously scrub at the stain. I simply reached up and wiped a single drop of wine from my jaw with the back of my hand. I pulled out my chair and sat down, refusing to break eye contact with Jessica, until she shifted her gaze away, unnerved by my complete lack of emotional reaction. Richard cleared his throat, calling the room to order. He slid a thick, freshly printed legal document across the polished wood of the dining table. It stopped directly in front of my stained blouse. "The terms have changed," Sloane Richard announced. His voice was heavy with assumed authority, dripping with the condescension of a patriarch lecturing a disobedient child. "The document you brought to the restaurant last night was an insult to this family. We require a foundation of absolute trust moving forward, especially given your reckless financial entanglements." I looked down at the document. It was a revised prenuptial agreement, but the clauses extended far beyond marital assets. The legal language was aggressive and unilateral. It demanded the immediate transfer of 51% of DataSync's voting shares to Julian Harrison. The purchase price listed for the controlling interest of my $120 million company was exactly $1. The contract framed the transfer as a gesture of good faith, a mechanism to ensure spousal fidelity and protect the Harrison family from the reputational damage I had allegedly caused. Julian leaned across the table. He reached out and placed his hand over my shoulder, adopting a tone of wounded, desperate affection. He played the role of the reluctant savior trying to rescue a damaged woman. "Just sign it, Sloane," Julian whispered, leaning close enough that I could smell the stale mints he used to mask his anxiety. "I spoke with the creditors today. I begged them for leniency. I negotiated a delay on the repayment. If you sign the company over to my management, I can protect you. I can shield you from the syndicate. I will handle the debt, and we can move past this. Just be reasonable, and I will keep you safe from those men." Julian was positioning himself as a shield against the very weapon he had aimed at my head. He expected me to collapse into his arms, grateful for his protection, oblivious to the fact that he was the architect of my execution. I looked at Julian's trembling hand on my shoulder. I looked at Jessica's triumphant sneer. I looked at Patricia's cold, calculating eyes. I looked at Richard waiting at the head of the table for his prize. I slowly moved my hand into the pocket of my blazer. My fingers brushed against the smooth plastic casing of my smartphone. I pressed the small tactile button on the side of the device, activating the high-definition audio recording application. The red light illuminated through the fabric of my pocket. I ensured every word spoken in this room would be captured, preserved, and eventually weaponized. I withdrew my hand from my pocket and rested it on the table, resting my fingertips gently on the surface of the fraudulent contract. I looked directly into Richard's eyes, projecting a calm, deliberate curiosity. And if I refused to sign, I asked, my voice cutting through the heavy silence of the dining room with absolute chilling clarity, "What exactly happens if I walk out of this house with my shares intact?" Richard slammed his open palm flat against the polished dining table. The heavy impact rattled the expensive crystal glassware and made the silverware jump. His face contorted, flushing a deep, aggressive red. The mask of the civilized patriarch vanished entirely, replaced by the ugly, desperate rage of a cornered predator. "If you refuse to sign that contract," Richard snarled, leaning across the table to invade my physical space, "you will wake up tomorrow morning to find your face plastered across the front page of every financial publication in this city. You will be branded as a federal money launderer. The pornographic video my son showed you will be distributed to every single one of your investors, your board members, and your competitors. Your reputation will be incinerated before breakfast. And after your company plummets into bankruptcy, those debt collectors you met in the alleyway will tear you apart to collect their $15 million. You will have no money, no credibility, and no protection. You sign the paper, or we bury you alive." The audio recorder in my pocket captured every syllable of his extortion attempt. The threat was explicit, detailed, and legally actionable. I had the evidence I needed to dismantle his entire operation. I reached for a crisp linen napkin from the center of the table. I did not rush. I did not flinch. I methodically dabbed at the wet wine stain spreading across my silk blouse, absorbing the excess liquid with slow, deliberate precision. The Harrison family watched me in absolute silence, unnerved by my refusal to panic. I set the damp napkin down beside the unsigned contract. I pushed my chair back and stood up. I smoothed the lines of my blazer. "I need some time to consider your generous offer," I said. My voice was calm, a sharp contrast to Richard's red-faced fury. I turned my back on the family and walked out of the dining room. I did not run. I walked down the long carpeted hallway, pulled open the heavy front door, and stepped out into the cool night air. The first phase of the trap was set, but I underestimated Julian's desperation. He did not grant me the time to consider. He did not wait for the morning. Driven by the suffocating pressure of the impending syndicate deadline, Julian launched a preemptive, catastrophic strike. At 7 o'clock the next morning, I pulled my SUV up to the curb outside the DataSync corporate headquarters in Manhattan. Before I even shifted the vehicle into park, I saw the chaos. A swarm of reporters, independent journalists, and paparazzi choked the entrance to my building. Camera flashes erupted like strobe lights against the glass facade. Microphones were shoved into the faces of my security personnel who were struggling to maintain a perimeter. I locked my doors, watching the frenzy unfold from behind my tinted windows. My phone vibrated aggressively in the cup holder. It was Victor Reed, my chief legal officer. "Sloane, check your social media feeds right now," Victor commanded, his voice tight with urgency. "Julian Harrison just dropped a nuclear bomb online." I opened my web browser. Julian had published a massive, detailed post across 3 major platforms. He included a carefully staged photograph of himself looking devastated and exhausted. The text was a masterpiece of manipulative fiction. He claimed that he had recently uncovered a massive fraud orchestrated by his fiancé. He accused me of being a sophisticated con artist who infiltrated his wealthy family to exploit their resources. He claimed I was using my tech company as a front to launder dirty money for organized crime syndicates. He painted himself as the tragic, heartbroken victim who narrowly escaped marrying a dangerous criminal, stating that he was working with authorities to expose my illicit operations. He weaponized his family's high society status to legitimize the lies. The post went viral within minutes. The narrative was perfect clickbait for the financial gossip columns. The wealthy heir exposes the fraudulent tech CEO. My phone began to ring endlessly. The screen lit up with notifications. The impact on my company was immediate and brutal. The stock valuation for DataSync, which traded on secondary private markets, began to plummet. Within 20 minutes, 2 of my largest enterprise clients sent formal emails threatening to suspend our service contracts pending an independent investigation. The digital mob was demanding answers, and the financial sector was reacting to the smoke Julian had intentionally blown into the room. The pressure was suffocating. I sat in my car watching my life's work take heavy public artillery fire. Julian had cornered me. He was attempting to destroy my credibility so thoroughly that when the syndicate loan defaulted at noon, no one would believe a word I said about his forgery. My private phone line buzzed. It was an encrypted number. I answered immediately. "Sloane, it is?" "Malik," the voice said rapidly, the background noise indicating he was walking briskly down a stairwell. They did not just post a sob story on the internet. Richard and Julian escalated the timeline. They called the Financial Crimes Division of the police department 20 minutes ago. They formally accused you of wire fraud and money laundering. They provided the police with the IP logs Julian falsified using your credentials. A tactical unit is currently en route to your office building. They have a warrant to seize your servers and your personal hardware. You need to evacuate the premises right now. I gripped the steering wheel. The Harrisons were trying to use the police as a blunt instrument to shut down my network before I could expose their shadow loan. If the authorities seized my servers, DataSync would go offline, the syndicate's funds would be trapped, and Julian would successfully frame me for the entire operation. There was no more time for defensive maneuvers. The syndicate deadline was hours away. The police were en route. The media was attempting to break through my front doors. I had to initiate the kill sequence. I disconnected the call with Malik. I did not call my legal team. I did not call the police. I dialed a direct unlisted number that the Harrison family could never have anticipated. I called the one man who possessed the jurisdiction and the firepower to dismantle Richard's empire before the police ever reached my servers. The wail of police sirens cut through the morning traffic. 4 unmarked black sedans and 2 marked cruisers screeched to a halt outside the DataSync headquarters. Men wearing tactical windbreakers emblazoned with the letters FBI pushed through the chaotic swarm of reporters blocking the entrance. I stepped out of my SUV and walked directly toward the lead agent. I did not run. I did not hide my face from the flashing cameras. I held a sleek titanium briefcase in my right hand. "I am Sloane Davis," I announced, projecting my voice above the shouting journalists. "I understand you have a warrant to examine my servers. My security chief is waiting for you in the lobby. We will grant you full administrative access to our entire network architecture." The lead agent looked surprised by my complete lack of resistance. He expected a frantic, defensive tech executive scrambling to call her lawyers. Instead, I escorted them straight into the server room, a climate-controlled vault, humming with rows of blinking mainframes. What the FBI agents did not know was that my cybersecurity team had spent the entire previous night executing a brilliant, aggressive maneuver. When Julian routed the syndicate's illicit funds through my network, he assumed he was planting a bomb that would destroy me. He did not realize I controlled the terrain. My engineers did not delete Julian's fabricated paper trail. Deleting evidence looks like guilt. Instead, we constructed a mirror firewall. We isolated the specific digital pathways Julian used to launder the money. We locked those pathways inside a transparent read-only quarantine zone. When the federal agents plugged their diagnostic equipment into my servers, they did not find a maze of hidden corporate fraud. The mirror firewall directed the FBI's tracing algorithms straight back to the source. The data packets bounced off my servers and illuminated a clear, undeniable path directly to the IP addresses registered to Richard Harrison's personal home network and Julian's private mobile devices. The agents stared at their monitors. The digital footprint proved that DataSync was not the architect of the money laundering scheme. DataSync was the hijacked vehicle. The true operators were sitting in the Harrison family estate. I handed the titanium briefcase to the lead agent. Inside was the encrypted drive Malik had given me, containing the original unedited metadata of Julian stealing my identity to forge the shadow loan. "You have the wrong suspect, gentlemen," I said, calmly watching the realization dawn on the faces of the federal investigators. "I highly recommend you redirect your tactical units to Westchester County before the suspects destroy their hard drives." The agents packed up their gear and moved out rapidly. The trap Julian set for me had just snapped shut around his own neck. But clearing my name with the federal authorities was only a defensive measure. I was not interested in merely surviving the Harrison family. I was going to dismantle their empire brick by brick. At exactly 1 o'clock in the afternoon, I executed the offensive protocol. The Harrison real estate empire relied on a centralized white-label property management software to operate their high-rise commercial buildings across Manhattan. They used this software to control security access, regulate elevator banks process, tenant billing, and monitor internal communications. Richard Harrison liked to boast about the modern, streamlined efficiency of his properties. What Richard continually overlooked in his arrogance was that his cutting-edge management software was licensed, maintained, and entirely hosted by DataSync. I sat at the massive oak desk in my private office. I nodded to my chief technology officer, who was monitoring the network from a laptop across the room. "Execute the suspension protocol," I ordered. My CTO pressed a single key. Across Manhattan, the Harrison empire plunged into absolute chaos. In a matter of seconds, the smart building infrastructure, controlling 12 commercial high-rises, went completely dark. The main elevator banks halted between floors. The electronic security turnstiles locked shut, trapping hundreds of furious tenants in the lobbies. The digital payment portals processing the monthly rent checks went offline. The internal communication networks linking the building managers to the central Harrison office severed entirely. Richard Harrison's prized real estate portfolio was instantly paralyzed. 10 minutes later, my private office phone rang. The caller ID displayed Richard's personal cell phone number. I let it ring 3 times before I picked up the receiver. I did not say hello. I simply listened to the sound of heavy, frantic breathing on the other end of the line. "What the hell are you doing to my buildings?" Richard roared. His voice was raw, stripped of all its usual aristocratic polish. "My building managers are calling me in a panic. The security gates are locked. The elevators are down. My tenants are threatening lawsuits. Turn the system back on right now." I leaned back in my leather chair. I picked up a delicate porcelain teacup and took a slow, deliberate sip of Earl Grey tea. "I am afraid I cannot do that, Richard," I replied, keeping my tone exceptionally polite and razor-sharp. "You seem to have forgotten a critical detail regarding your operational infrastructure. DataSync provides the proprietary management software for your entire portfolio. Turn it on." Richard screamed, the panic rising in his chest as the reality of the situation began to crush him. "You cannot hold my properties hostage. I will sue you for breach of contract." "You cannot sue me, Richard," I countered smoothly. "If you read Section 4, Paragraph B of our service agreement, you will find a strict compliance clause. DataSync reserves the right to instantly suspend all services if we detect any fraudulent financial activity originating from the client's network. Since the FBI just informed me that your personal IP addresses were used to launder illicit funds through our servers, we were legally obligated to freeze your systems to prevent further federal crimes." The silence on the other end of the line was absolute. Richard realized that his attempt to frame me for money laundering had given me the exact legal justification I needed to shut down his business. I had weaponized his own crime against him. "The FBI is currently securing warrants for your arrest." Richard, I continued, my voice cold and unyielding. "The shadow lending syndicate you borrowed $15 million from is likely watching your buildings fail, wondering why you have not paid them. Your empire is currently offline, and I am the one holding the power cord." I disconnected the call without waiting for his response. The first guillotine blade had officially dropped. But Patricia Harrison, desperate to save her fading social status, was about to make a catastrophic miscalculation. She believed she could still control the narrative through public humiliation. She did not realize she was setting up a stage for her own execution. The suspension of the Harrison property management software sent a shockwave through their financial defenses, but Patricia Harrison operated in a different currency. She traded in social capital reputation and high society leverage. Cornered and desperate, she executed a vicious, highly public ambush designed to force my submission through sheer humiliation. 2 days after the FBI raided the Harrison servers, a heavy cream-colored envelope arrived at my office via private courier. It was an invitation to a bridal shower honoring Sloane Davis, hosted by Patricia Harrison at the Grand Ballroom of the Plaza Hotel. The guest list included the wives of major Manhattan developers, female executives from partnered venture capital firms, and the most influential socialites in New York. Patricia was weaponizing my absence. If I did not attend the shower, I would tacitly confirm Julian's fabricated internet narrative. The elite circles of New York would brand me a cowardly, fraudulent runaway. I would be convicted in the court of public opinion, severely damaging DataSync's corporate reputation, just as we were fighting to clear our name with federal regulators. Patricia believed she had boxed me in. She assumed a tech executive would wither under the aggressive scrutiny of 50 hostile aristocrats. I RSVP'd yes. I arrived at the Plaza Hotel, wearing a sharply tailored blood-red blazer and black trousers. I did not wear the soft pastels or floral prints expected of a blushing bride-to-be. I dressed for a courtroom, not a celebration. I pushed open the heavy double doors of the Grand Ballroom and stepped into the ambush. The room fell dead silent the moment my heels clicked against the marble floor. 50 pairs of eyes locked onto me. The stares were not welcoming. They were sharp judging and intensely hostile. Women whispered behind their crystal champagne flutes. I felt the collective weight of their disdain pressing down on me. My eyes moved to the front of the room. Patricia had abandoned any pretense of a traditional bridal shower. A massive digital projector screen dominated the stage. Displayed in high resolution were screenshots of the viral defamatory articles Julian had planted online. Headlines reading, "Heir Escapes Fraudulent Tech CEO," and "The DataSync Money Laundering Scandal" blared across the screen for every guest to see. Patricia had turned the bridal shower into a public tribunal. Patricia stood at the center of the stage, gripping a microphone. She wore a somber, elegant black dress, playing the role of the wounded, magnanimous matriarch. She saw me enter the room and immediately raised the microphone to her lips, ensuring the entire ballroom heard her performance. Sloane Patricia began, her voice trembling with manufactured sorrow. A few of the older women in the front row murmured in sympathy for her. "We are so heartbroken that you chose to attend today. We truly hoped you would do the right thing and stay away after the pain you have caused Julian." I walked slowly down the center aisle, maintaining a perfectly neutral expression. I did not avert my gaze. I did not rush. "We know about the debts you owe to those terrible people in the criminal underworld," Patricia continued, projecting her voice to reach the back rows. "We know you tried to use our family name to legitimize your fraudulent business. Julian is devastated. His heart is broken by your betrayal." The murmurs in the ballroom grew louder. A woman sitting near the aisle scoffed in disgust as I walked past her table. The hostility was palpable. Patricia was successfully rallying the elite crowd against me, painting me as a predator who exploited her innocent son. "But our family believes in grace," Patricia announced, placing a hand over her heart in a gesture of profound theatrical mercy. "We are willing to halt the public exposure of your crimes. We are willing to forgive your terrible mistakes, Sloane. But there must be restitution for the severe damage you have done to the Harrison legacy." She paused, allowing the tension in the room to build. "You will sign over the voting rights of your company to Julian's management firm," Patricia demanded, dropping the facade of sorrow and revealing the cold, calculating extortion beneath. "You will publicly apologize for your fraud, and you will walk away from this family quietly. If you do this, we will show you mercy. If you refuse, this room full of influential women will ensure you never conduct business in this city again." The trap was fully sprung. Patricia had isolated me in a room full of powerful enemies demanding my company in exchange for my reputation. She expected me to break down, to cry, to beg for a quiet exit. She expected a victim. I did not stop walking until I reached the edge of the stage. I looked up at Patricia. I did not look intimidated. I looked bored. I stepped past the podium and walked directly toward the audio-visual control table positioned on the side of the stage. A young technician wearing a hotel uniform looked at me in confusion. I reached into my blazer pocket, retrieved my smartphone, and grabbed the auxiliary audio cable connected to the main ballroom sound system. I plugged the cable directly into the headphone jack of my device. "What are you doing?" Patricia snapped, her voice losing its manufactured warmth. "Step away from the equipment." I tapped the screen of my phone, opening the encrypted audio file I had saved 2 nights prior. I picked up a spare microphone resting on the technician's table. "I appreciate your generous offer of forgiveness, Patricia," I said. My voice echoed through the massive speakers, crisp, loud, and entirely devoid of fear. The women in the audience stopped whispering. The sudden shift in power demanded their attention. However, I told the crowd, sweeping my gaze across the 50 bewildered guests. "Before anyone in this room decides who needs to be forgiven, I think you should all hear exactly how the Harrison family conducts their private business negotiations." I pressed play on my phone. The high-definition audio recording from the Harrison dining room blasted through the ballroom's surround sound system. The acoustics amplified Richard's aggressive, booming voice so clearly that it felt as though he were standing on the stage with us. "If you refuse to sign that contract," Richard's recorded voice snarled, "you will wake up tomorrow morning to find your face plastered across the front page of every financial publication in this city. You will be branded as a federal money launderer. The pornographic video my son showed you will be distributed to every single one of your investors." A collective, horrified gasp rippled through the audience. The wives of the wealthy developers and venture capitalists stared at the speakers in sheer shock. The recording continued, capturing Julian's desperate, pleading tone. "I spoke with the creditors today. I begged them for leniency. I negotiated a delay on the repayment. If you sign the company over to my management, I can protect you. I can shield you from the syndicate." The illusion of the wealthy, respectable Harrison family shattered into 1,000,000 irreparable pieces right in front of Patricia's eyes. The elite women in the room realized instantly that they had not been invited to a bridal shower. They had been invited to participate in an extortion plot orchestrated by a bankrupt family tied to organized crime. The recording captured my own voice, calm and inquisitive. And if I refuse to sign, what exactly happens if I walk out of this house with my shares intact? Richard's voice roared back, raw and violent. You sign the paper or we bury you alive. I tapped the screen on my phone, stopping the playback. The heavy, oppressive silence that followed was deafening. The 50 influential women in the ballroom were no longer glaring at me. They were staring at Patricia Harrison with naked, unadulterated disgust. The social capital Patricia had spent decades cultivating evaporated in less than 60 seconds. Patricia's face turned a horrifying shade of pale green. Her hands trembled so violently she dropped her microphone. It hit the wooden stage with a loud, screeching feedback loop. She stumbled backward, clutching the podium for support, as the reality of her social destruction crushed her. I unplugged my phone and placed it back into my blazer pocket. I looked at the audience of wealthy socialites, then turned my attention back to Patricia. Data Sync is not bankrupt, Patricia, I said calmly, my voice carrying clearly without the aid of a microphone. The Harrison Real Estate Group is facing foreclosure, and your son owes $15 million to a criminal syndicate. You tried to use these women to steal my company. I suggest you find a new way to pay your debts. I turned my back on the stage. I walked up the center aisle, passing the tables of stunned guests. No one whispered insults as I passed. No one looked at me with pity. They parted like the Red Sea, getting out of my way. I pushed through the heavy double doors and exited the Plaza Hotel. The social ambush was dismantled, but the physical threat remained. As I stepped out onto the busy Manhattan street and signaled for my driver, a dark figure emerged from the shadows near the hotel loading zone. The battle for reputation was over. The battle for survival was just beginning. The high-definition audio recording echoed through the pristine acoustics of the Plaza Hotel ballroom. Richard Harrison's baritone voice, usually reserved for charity galas and elite boardrooms, boomed over the surround sound speakers with a raw, undeniable hostility. If you refuse to sign that contract, Richard's recorded voice snarled, the digital playback capturing every ounce of his predatory rage. You will wake up tomorrow morning to find your face plastered across the front page of every financial publication in this city. You will be branded as a federal money launderer. The 50 elite guests froze in their seats. The soft clinking of fine crystal champagne flutes ceased entirely. The wealthy wives of Manhattan's most prominent developers and venture capitalists stared at the stage in sheer, unadulterated shock. A prominent socialite sitting in the front row pressed a manicured hand over her mouth, her eyes darting frantically toward Patricia Harrison. The audio file continued to play, unspooling the Harrison family's darkest secrets into the opulent room. Jessica's voice chimed in next, a sharp, cruel laugh captured perfectly on the recording. I assumed you were already accustomed to being filthy, she mocked, the disdain in her tone unmistakable. Then came the final devastating piece of evidence. Julian's frantic, hushed confession from the dining room filled the ballroom. I spoke with the creditors today, Julian pleaded on the tape. I begged them for leniency. I negotiated a delay on the repayment. If you sign the company over to my management, I can protect you. I can shield you from the shadow syndicate. The illusion of the wealthy, respectable Harrison family shattered into a million irreparable pieces. The influential women in the room realized instantly that they had not been invited to a bridal shower. They had been manipulated into participating in an extortion plot orchestrated by a bankrupt family tied to organized crime. The collective gasp that rippled through the audience carried a heavy judging weight. Patricia Harrison stood on the stage, her manufactured composure breaking like brittle glass. The rosy flush of her cheeks drained away in seconds, leaving her skin a stark, sickly white. The high society matron realized her carefully curated empire was burning to ash in front of her most important peers. Panic replaced her rehearsed elegance. She dropped her crystal champagne flute. It shattered against the wooden floorboards of the stage, but the sound was drowned out by the damning audio still playing from the main speakers. Patricia scrambled off the stage, her designer heels catching on the plush carpet. She lunged toward the audio-visual control table where I stood. Her eyes were wide, feral, and desperate. She reached out with shaking hands, aiming to rip the auxiliary cable from the soundboard to silence the recording. I anticipated the move. I shifted my weight, stepping directly into her path. I raised my left arm and caught her wrist mid-air. I did not squeeze hard, but my grip was unyielding. Patricia gasped, her chest heaving as she tried to pull her arm back, but I held her firmly in place. Her eyes met mine silently, begging me to stop the social execution. The scent of her expensive perfume mixed with the sour, sharp odor of her nervous sweat. I let go of her wrist. I reached over to the control panel and unplugged my smartphone, cutting the audio feed. The silence that followed was suffocating. I picked up the microphone from the technician's table. "I owe the Harrison family nothing," I announced. My voice resonated over the lingering static of the speakers, calm, steady, and devoid of any pity. I looked out at the sea of pale, horrified faces. The Harrison Group is facing imminent foreclosure, and Julian Harrison is a fraud who weaponized my identity to secure a shadow loan from an underground syndicate. Enjoy the rest of your party. I dropped the microphone onto the table. It landed with a dull thud. I turned and walked down the center aisle. The influential women of New York parted, instantly pulling their chairs in to avoid brushing against me. Their initial disdain had transformed into a potent mixture of fear and awe. I heard the frantic tapping of fingers on smartphone screens. The gossip was already transmitting across the city. Patricia's social destruction was finalized before I even reached the lobby. I pushed through the gilded revolving doors of the Plaza Hotel. The crisp evening air hit my face, a sharp contrast to the stifling atmosphere of the ballroom. I walked toward the valet stand, waiting for the attendant to bring my SUV around. The street lamps illuminated the busy Manhattan sidewalk. Taxis honked in the distance. The battle for my reputation was over. I had cleared my name in the most public forum imaginable. I took a slow breath, centering my focus, ready to return to my office, and finish dismantling Richard's remaining financial structures. The shadow near the loading zone shifted. A figure detached from the darkness behind a concrete pillar. It was Julian. He did not look like the polished heir apparent anymore. His custom-tailored suit jacket was crumpled and missing buttons. His tie hung loosely around his collar. Dark, heavy circles underscored his bloodshot eyes. His hair, usually styled to perfection, was unkempt and damp with sweat. He looked feral, stripped of every protection his family name provided. He had clearly been waiting for me outside, hunting me down as his world collapsed. Before I could signal the valet or turn back toward the hotel security guards, Julian lunged. He crossed the pavement in 3 rapid, desperate strides. He reached out and grabbed the lapels of my red blazer. His hands shook with raw, unrestrained desperation. He shoved me backward. My shoulder blades slammed hard against the cold metal door of a parked town car. The sudden impact knocked the breath from my lungs, but I did not cry out. I planted my feet, staring directly into his frantic, erratic eyes. "You think you won?" Sloane Julian hissed. His breath smelled of stale liquor and sheer terror. Spittle flew from his lips, landing on my cheek. "You think walking out of that room makes you safe? You just signed my death warrant. The syndicate's deadline is tomorrow at noon. When they realize the funds are frozen, they are going to collect the collateral by any means necessary." I wedged my forearms between us, attempting to break his hold, but terror gave him a manic, unpredictable strength. He leaned in closer, his face mere inches from mine. His lips curled into a sickening, desperate sneer. "They are not just coming for your company servers," Julian whispered, his voice dropping to a lethal, trembling pitch. "They want leverage. I knew you would lock down your data networks. I needed an insurance policy to make sure you paid my debt." The cold air around me seemed to vanish, replaced by a suffocating vacuum. The conflict had just mutated from corporate warfare into a direct physical threat. "I gave them a new target." Julian continued, a deranged smile touching the corners of his mouth. "I gave them your parents' home address in Ohio." My heart stalled in my chest. The cool, analytical CEO facade I had maintained throughout the entire ordeal cracked internally. My parents were retired school teachers living a quiet life in a suburban neighborhood outside of Cleveland. They knew nothing about data infrastructure shadow syndicates or the Harrison family's criminal collapse. They were innocent. Julian had painted a target on their backs just to buy himself a few hours of leniency from ruthless criminals. He had traded my family's lives to cover his own theft. The rules of engagement were obliterated. This was no longer about saving Data Sync or protecting my assets. The syndicate enforcers I met in the alleyway were not men who sent warning letters. They were men who burned things to the ground. Julian's confession shifted the stakes to the ultimate extreme, and the countdown to noon felt like a ticking bomb resting directly against my throat. Julian's hands gripped my lapels, his knuckles white, desperate to see terror break across my face. He wanted me to beg. He expected me to crumble to offer him the $15 million to save my parents from the syndicate enforcers he had unleashed. I felt the sharp edge of adrenaline spike through my system, but the cold, analytical part of my brain took immediate control. The last remnant of my restraint, the final lingering instinct to handle this conflict, discreetly evaporated entirely. Julian had crossed a line that removed any possibility of mercy. I raised both my arms and drove my forearms upward, striking the inside of Julian's elbows with a hard, violent thrust. The sudden, sharp impact broke his grip instantly. He stumbled backward, gasping as his arms flailed for balance. Before he could recover, I stepped forward and shoved him hard against the brick facade of the hotel loading dock. He slid down the wall, clutching his bruised arms, staring up at me in stunned silence. I did not scream at him. I did not waste my breath on threats. I turned my back on the ruined heir of the Harrison Empire, walked to my SUV, which the valet had just pulled to the curb, and climbed inside. The heavy door slammed shut. I locked the vehicle, shifted into drive, and merged seamlessly into the chaotic flow of Manhattan traffic. Julian thought he held the ultimate leverage. He thought he had outsmarted me by targeting my family in Ohio. He failed to realize that a CEO who builds mirror firewalls to trap federal investigators does not leave physical vulnerabilities exposed. My parents were not in Ohio. Anticipating that the Harrisons would eventually escalate to physical threats once their financial walls crumbled, I had already executed a relocation protocol. 7 days prior, I hired a private security contractor to transport my parents to an isolated, secure resort in the mountains of Colorado, entirely under an assumed name. Their home in Ohio was currently empty, monitored by high-definition security cameras linking directly to the local police precinct. Let the syndicate break down an empty door. They would find nothing but handcuffs waiting for them. My family was safe. The syndicate threat was neutralized. It was time to extinguish the Harrison Empire permanently. The following morning at exactly 8:30, I sat in the executive boardroom of DataSync headquarters. Victor Reed, my chief legal officer, sat across the mahogany table reviewing the final financial strike package. The Harrison Real Estate Group was a hollow shell bleeding cash and crippled by the software suspension I initiated the previous day. However, Richard Harrison possessed one final lifeline. He had spent the last 6 months aggressively negotiating a $50 million bailout package from a private equity firm known as Vanguard Capital Partners. The cash injection was scheduled to clear at noon today. It was the only capital that could stave off total foreclosure and appease his legitimate creditors. What Richard failed to investigate during his desperate scramble for cash was the ownership structure of Vanguard Capital Partners. The private equity firm was a wholly owned subsidiary, a holding entity operating under the umbrella of DataSync's corporate venture division. Richard was unknowingly begging his future daughter-in-law for a $50 million bailout. "Cancel the Vanguard disbursement," I instructed Victor, my voice steady, reflecting no hesitation. "Terminate the agreement effective immediately." Victor typed a rapid sequence of commands into his tablet. "Done," he confirmed. "The $50 million capital injection is officially dead. The Harrison Group will not see a single cent. Do not stop there." I continued, leaning forward and resting my elbows on the polished table. "We hold the primary debt notes on 3 of their most valuable commercial properties through our subsidiary acquisitions. Enact the immediate recall clause on those loans. Cite the ongoing federal investigation into their money laundering activities as a material breach of trust. Demand full repayment of the principal balance by the end of the business day." Victor looked up from his screen, a faint predatory smile touching the corners of his mouth. "A full debt recall coupled with the canceled bailout. They will not survive the afternoon. The banks will lock their accounts to protect their own liabilities the moment they receive the recall notices. Execute the order I commanded." The financial chokehold tightened with devastating speed. The collapse of the Harrison Empire was not a slow decay. It was a sudden, violent implosion. At 12:15 in the afternoon, Richard, Patricia, and Julian sat at a corner table in an exclusive midtown restaurant, desperately attempting to project an image of normalcy despite the looming crisis. Richard ordered a bottle of vintage Bordeaux, confident that the $50 million Vanguard deposit had cleared and saved his legacy. When the waiter returned to the table, he did not carry an uncorked bottle of wine. He carried a silver tray holding Richard's sleek black titanium credit card. "I am terribly sorry, Mr. Harrison," the waiter whispered, leaning in close to avoid drawing attention. "The card was declined. I tried running it twice. The system indicates a hard freeze on the account." Richard snatched the card from the tray, his face flushing a deep, embarrassed red. He pulled a different corporate card from his leather wallet and shoved it at the waiter. "Try this one." 5 minutes later, the waiter returned, looking increasingly uncomfortable. "Declined as well, sir." Patricia began rummaging through her designer handbag, her manicured hands trembling as she pulled out her personal platinum card. "Try mine," she demanded, her voice rising in panic. The rejection was absolute. Within a 20-minute window, the automated banking algorithms, triggered by the massive debt recall notices issued by my legal team, had frozen every single account tied to the Harrison name. Personal checking, corporate holdings, offshore trusts, all of it was locked down, pending federal review. The Harrisons were completely severed from their wealth. They walked out of the restaurant in a humiliating silent procession, unable to pay for a simple lunch. At 2 o'clock, the lobby of the Data Sync building erupted in chaos. Richard Harrison stormed through the revolving glass doors, accompanied by 2 frantic, visibly sweating attorneys. His face was purple with rage. He looked deranged, a king who had just realized his crown was made of cardboard. He marched directly toward the reception desk, slamming his fist against the polished granite surface. "I want to see Sloane Davis right now." Richard roared, his voice echoing off the high ceilings and drawing the attention of dozens of employees and visiting clients. "Tell her to get down here. She cannot freeze my accounts. I will destroy this company." I watched the security feed from the monitors in my office on the top floor. I did not go down to meet him. I did not engage. I pressed the intercom button connecting me to the head of building security. "Escort Mr. Harrison and his legal counsel off the premises," I ordered calmly. "Use physical force if they resist. Ensure the removal occurs through the main entrance." 3 heavily built security guards moved swiftly across the lobby. They did not ask Richard to leave. They flanked him, firmly gripping his arms, and marched him toward the exit. Richard thrashed and shouted, his voice cracking as he spewed threats that no longer carried any weight. His lawyers scrambled behind him, trying to maintain some semblance of dignity as they were physically ejected from the building. The security guards pushed Richard through the revolving doors, depositing him onto the busy Manhattan sidewalk. A crowd of pedestrians, already alerted by the commotion, stopped to watch the spectacle. Several people raised their smartphones, recording the once untouchable real estate tycoon stumbling on the pavement, screaming impotently at a glass building he could no longer enter. The illusion of his power was gone, replaced by the pathetic reality of his complete financial ruin. I turned off the security feed and walked back to my desk. The corporate execution was complete. The Harrisons were broke, publicly humiliated, and facing federal scrutiny. But the final fatal blow to their criminal enterprise was not going to come from me. It was going to come from inside their own family. The financial chokehold I applied to the Harrison empire severed their access to capital, but the killing blow did not originate from Data Sync. The final destruction of the Harrison legacy came from the very core of their own fractured family structure. The collapse accelerated with a brutal internal betrayal that no one in the high society circles of New York anticipated. At 4 o'clock that afternoon, a media advisory alert flashed across the screens of every major financial news outlet in the city. A press conference regarding the ongoing federal investigation into the Harrison Real Estate Group was scheduled for 5 o'clock at the New York Hilton Midtown. The public assumption, fueled by Richard's aggressive reputation, was that the patriarch would take the podium. The journalists expected Richard to deliver a defiant, bombastic defense threatening lawsuits and blaming market conditions for his sudden banking freeze. Richard himself, currently huddled with his panicked legal team in a rented conference room across town, assumed one of his highly paid defense attorneys had organized the briefing to manage the escalating crisis. When the heavy velvet curtains of the Hilton ballroom parted, Richard Harrison did not walk onto the stage. Julian Harrison did not appear to defend his honor. Malik walked out from the wings. He moved with the measured predatory calm of a seasoned auditor walking into a hostile boardroom. He wore a crisp, tailored navy suit. His posture was impeccable, devoid of the submissive slouch he had adopted during family dinners for the past 5 years. Malik stepped up to the wooden podium, adjusting the cluster of microphones arrayed before him. The flashing bulbs of 50 cameras illuminated his stoic, unreadable face. The room fell silent, the seasoned financial reporters recognizing immediately that the narrative was shifting in a catastrophic direction for the Harrisons. "Good afternoon," Malik began, his voice echoing through the ballroom, steady, deep, and devoid of any emotional tremor. "My name is Malik, and until 10 minutes ago I served as the Chief Financial Officer for the Harrison Real Estate Group. I am holding this press conference today to formally announce my immediate resignation from that position." A murmur rippled through the press corps. The CFO jumping ship in the middle of a federal crisis was a massive red flag. But Malik was not simply fleeing a sinking vessel. He was detonating the explosive charges he had quietly planted in the hull. Malik reached into his leather briefcase resting on the shelf of the podium. He withdrew a thick, dense stack of bound documents, dropping the heavy file onto the wood surface with a loud, authoritative thud. "I am not simply resigning." Malik continued scanning the room, making direct eye contact with the lead financial correspondents. "With this dossier, I am formally initiating whistleblower protocols under the protection of the Securities and Exchange Commission. As the principal custodian of the financial ledgers, I am publicly accusing Richard Harrison and Julian Harrison of systemic coordinated financial fraud." The murmurs in the ballroom erupted into a chaotic frenzy of shouted questions and aggressive camera flashes. Malik raised his hand, silencing the room with a single commanding gesture. Over the past 3 years, Malik stated his delivery remaining analytical and lethal. The Harrison Real Estate Group has not operated as a legitimate development firm. They have functioned as an elaborate Ponzi scheme. They aggressively solicited capital from new investors to pay the exorbitant mounting debts of their failing commercial properties. Furthermore, when that fraudulent capital ran dry, Julian Harrison initiated contact with an underground lending syndicate. Malik opened the dossier, holding up a dense spreadsheet detailing offshore wire transfers. Julian Harrison fabricated collateral documents to secure a $15 million shadow loan, Malik revealed, driving the final nail into the coffin. He then engaged in extensive money laundering, attempting to route those illicit funds through the digital infrastructure of an independent technology firm to obscure the origin of the capital. Every shell company, every falsified tax return, and every fraudulent wire transfer is documented in this file, which has already been submitted to the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the District Attorney's Office. The press conference concluded abruptly. Malik did not take questions. He gathered his documents, turned his back on the chaotic swarm of journalists, and exited the stage. He had delivered the fatal blow. The Harrison empire was no longer just bankrupt. It was a confirmed criminal syndicate. Malik exited the hotel through the underground parking garage flanked by 2 private security contractors I had quietly provided for his exit. The damp concrete space echoed with the sound of approaching footsteps. Jessica stood blocking the exit ramp. She had watched the live broadcast from her smartphone while sitting in her luxury car. Her designer makeup was ruined, streaked with tears of pure, unadulterated rage. Her face was twisted into an ugly, hateful snarl. The entitled heiress realized that her husband had just incinerated her entire existence. "You traitor!" Jessica screamed, her voice cracking as she lunged toward Malik. Her manicured hands clawed the air, desperate to strike his face. The security contractor stepped forward to intercept her, but Malik raised a hand, signaling them to hold their position. "You ruined this family!" Jessica shrieked, tears of fury spilling down her cheeks. "We took you in. My father gave you a career. You were nothing before you married me, and you just destroyed everything we built. You stabbed us in the back." Malik stood perfectly still. He looked at the woman he had been married to for 5 years. He did not look angry. He did not look vindictive. He looked at her with the cold, detached pity one reserves for an insect. "I did not betray your family," Jessica, Malik said softly, his voice echoing in the concrete garage devoid of any warmth. "I simply stopped protecting a syndicate of criminals. Your father did not give me a career. He gave me a front-row seat to his corruption, assuming I was too grateful or too stupid to understand what I was looking at. I was wrong." Malik reached into the pocket of his trousers. He withdrew his heavy platinum wedding band. He did not hand it to her. He did not throw it in anger. He simply opened his hand and let the ring drop. The heavy metal clattered against the oil-stained concrete floor. It rolled a few inches, coming to a rest near the pointed toe of Jessica's designer heel. "You are going to lose everything," Jessica Malik stated, turning his back on his wife for the final time. "I suggest you call a very good defense attorney." Malik walked past her, ignoring her continued screaming, and climbed into the waiting town car. The vehicle sped up the ramp, leaving the ruined heiress standing alone in the dark garage, screaming at an empty space. The fallout from Malik's dossier was instantaneous. The federal authorities, now armed with a verified roadmap of the Harrisons' financial crimes, moved with terrifying efficiency. Within an hour of the press conference, federal judges signed emergency arrest warrants. The remaining assets of the Harrison family, including the Westchester estate, the luxury vehicles, and the offshore holding accounts, were immediately seized by the government. The illusion was entirely shattered. The Harrison empire collapsed in a spectacular, very public freefall, leaving Julian scrambling in the rubble, desperate for a lifeline that no longer existed. Within 48 hours of Malik stepping down from the podium at the Hilton, the federal government dismantled the Harrison family's material existence. The speed of the collapse was breathtaking. Armed agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation descended upon the sprawling Westchester estate before dawn. Yellow crime scene tape was stretched across the ornate iron gates. The fleet of luxury vehicles, symbols of their manufactured aristocracy, was unceremoniously towed away on flatbed trucks, seized as assets purchased with laundered funds. Patricia Harrison was photographed by paparazzi, being escorted from her country club in tears, her platinum credit cards declining at the valet stand. Julian Harrison, the golden heir who had confidently threatened to incinerate my life just days prior, was effectively erased from society. With his accounts frozen and his face broadcasting across every major news network, as a person of interest in a federal racketeering case, Julian could not check into a hotel. He could not book a flight. He could not access the offshore accounts Malik had exposed. Worse still, the shadow lending syndicate realized their $15 million loan was tied to fabricated collateral. The loan had defaulted. The enforcers were actively hunting him, and Julian possessed zero resources to protect himself. I was reduced to hiding in a cheap cash-only motel in Queens, terrified of every passing shadow. Desperation strips away arrogance very quickly. When a man realizes he is entirely out of options, he retreats to the one person he believes he can manipulate. At 2 o'clock in the morning, the heavy brass knocker on my apartment door echoed through my silent living room. My private security detail stationed in the lobby of my building had already notified me of his arrival. I instructed the guards to let him up, monitoring his approach through the security cameras installed in the hallway. I wanted to look him in the eye when the final reality settled over him. I walked to the front door wearing a simple silk robe, holding a steaming mug of black coffee in my left hand. I unlatched the deadbolt and pulled the heavy door open a few inches, leaving the steel security chain firmly engaged. Julian stood in the dim light of the corridor. The transformation was startling. The immaculate grooming, the expensive cologne, the posture of unearned superiority had completely vanished. He wore a wrinkled, stained hoodie pulled up over his head. His face was pale slick with a nervous, greasy sweat. Dark, bruised circles hung beneath his panicked eyes. He looked physically diminished, a hollow shell of the man who had tried to extort my company. When Julian saw my face through the crack in the door, his knees simply gave out. The heir to the Harrison empire collapsed onto the hallway runner. He did not kneel in a gesture of respect. He fell in a heap of total, unfiltered terror. He reached through the opening, his trembling fingers clutching desperately at the bottom edge of the heavy wooden door. Tears streamed down his face, mixing with the grime on his cheeks. Sloane Julian sobbed, his voice cracking, reduced to a pathetic, high-pitched whine. "Sloane, please. I am so sorry. I am so sorry. You have to help me." I did not step back. I did not flinch. I stood perfectly still, looking down at the man who had threatened to release fabricated pornography to destroy my reputation. I took a slow sip of my hot coffee, letting the silence stretch, forcing him to stew in his own degradation. "My father forced me to do it," Julian begged, shifting the blame with the instinctual cowardice I always knew he possessed. "Richard orchestrated the entire loan. He made me steal your digital signature. I did not want to hurt you, Sloane. I swear to God I never wanted to hurt you." I looked at his trembling hands. "You did not seem reluctant when you cornered me in the VIP lounge, Julian. You seemed quite eager to leverage my company to save your trust fund." Julian shook his head frantically, fresh tears spilling over his jawline. I was terrified of him. I was terrified of losing everything. "Sloane, please, the syndicate is looking for me. The men you saw in the alleyway, they found my motel tonight. I barely escaped out the back window. If they catch me, they are going to kill me. They are going to break my legs and kill me." He pressed his forehead against the cold metal track of the doorway, his shoulders heaving with violent sobs. "Please, Sloane," Julian pleaded, his voice dropping to a desperate, pathetic whisper. "Call off your lawyers. Withdraw the federal complaint. Unfreeze the Vanguard capital injection. If you release the funds, I can pay the syndicate. I can make them go away. I will do anything you want. I will sign whatever you want. I will leave the country. Just do not let them kill me." I stared down at the trembling, broken man crying on my floor mat. I felt absolutely no pity. I felt no residual affection. I did not feel the triumphant rush of revenge I expected. I only felt the cold, clinical satisfaction of observing the laws of physics. Gravity always pulls downward. Actions always generate equal and opposite reactions. Julian was not experiencing a tragedy. He was simply experiencing the math he had calculated incorrectly. "Julian," I said softly. My voice was calm, devoid of anger, entirely indifferent to his suffering. "Do you remember the terms of the prenuptial agreement your father slid across the dining room table?" Julian looked up at me, his eyes wide, confused by the question. He nodded rapidly, eager to agree with whatever I said, hoping agreement would buy him mercy. Yes, I remember it. "Do you remember the specific verbal amendment your father attached to that contract?" I asked, taking another slow sip of my coffee. "Do you remember what you promised would happen to me if I refused to sign away my company, my assets, and my dignity?" Julian swallowed hard. His throat bobbed. He remembered. The threat was burned into his memory just as clearly as it was burned into mine. "You promised that if I did not submit to your extortion, you would ruin me." I continued my tone, remaining perfectly level. "You promised to destroy my reputation, bankrupt my company, and hand me over to the very debt collectors who are currently hunting you. You designed a blueprint for my total annihilation. Sloane, please, that was Richard." Julian cried out, reaching a hand through the crack in the door, trying to grasp the fabric of my robe. I pulled back, ensuring he touched nothing but empty air. "No, Julian," I corrected him, my voice turning to ice. "That was the rule of engagement your family established. You set the parameters of this conflict. You demanded absolute destruction if you did not get what you wanted." I looked down into his terrified, bloodshot eyes one final time. I felt the absolute certainty of my decision settle deep into my bones. "I am simply executing the exact terms of the contract you designed, Julian," I whispered. "But I am executing them against you." I reached forward and pushed the heavy wooden door. Julian scrambled backward, pulling his fingers away before the heavy oak slammed shut. The deadbolt engaged with a loud metallic crack, echoing with absolute finality. I walked back to my kitchen, the sound of his muffled sobbing fading into the ambient noise of the city, leaving him alone in the hallway to face the monsters he had invited to the table. The absolute silence of my apartment following Julian's pathetic departure did not bring me peace. It brought clarity. The Harrison Empire was structurally demolished. Their assets were frozen, their reputations incinerated, and their criminal liabilities exposed to the federal government. By all logical metrics, the war was over. But I understood the psychology of cornered predators. Richard Harrison was not a man who accepted defeat. He was a narcissist who had operated above the law for decades. When a man like Richard loses his kingdom, he does not surrender gracefully. He burns the remaining earth around him, determined to take his executioner down in the flames. I anticipated a final desperate act of violence. I did not anticipate how rapidly it would arrive. The following morning at exactly 6:45, I entered the private subterranean parking garage beneath the DataSync headquarters. The concrete cavern was dimly lit and eerily quiet, save for the hum of the ventilation system. My security detail was stationed in the main lobby above, maintaining the perimeter against the lingering press corps. I walked toward my reserved parking bay, the sharp click of my heels echoing off the reinforced concrete walls. As I reached for the handle of my SUV, A shadow detached itself from the thick concrete pillar adjacent to my vehicle. I did not have time to react. A hand clamped down hard on my shoulder, spinning me around with brutal force. Before I could process the sudden assault, the cold, heavy barrel of a firearm was jammed forcefully into my ribs, pressing tight against the fabric of my trench coat. "Get in the car," Sloane, a voice rasped. It was Richard Harrison. He looked nothing like the polished patriarch who had commanded the dining room table just days prior. The transformation was horrifying. He was unshaven, his skin a mottled, unhealthy red. He wore a dark, uncharacteristically cheap jacket, completely unsuited for a man of his former status. The smell of stale alcohol and sheer manic desperation radiated off him. But it was his eyes that signaled the true danger. They were bloodshot wide and completely unhinged. The calculating businessman was gone. He was replaced by a feral, cornered animal operating entirely on the instinct to survive and destroy. "Get in the car!" Richard repeated, his voice dropping to a harsh, trembling whisper. He shoved the barrel of the gun harder into my side, forcing me to stumble against the door of my SUV. "Get in the driver's seat or I will put a bullet through your spine right here. I have absolutely nothing left to lose." The cold metal digging into my ribs confirmed his statement. He was beyond reason. He was a fugitive facing decades in a federal penitentiary and the lethal wrath of a shadow syndicate. He had crossed the threshold of rationality. I did not scream. I did not attempt to disarm an unstable man holding a loaded weapon against my torso. I maintained the clinical detachment that had kept me alive thus far. I reached into my coat pocket. "Do not touch your phone," Richard hissed, pulling back the hammer of the firearm with a sharp, terrifying click. "I am getting my car keys, Richard," I replied, my voice steady, betraying none of the adrenaline flooding my system. I slowly withdrew the electronic key fob, keeping my movements deliberate and visible. The vehicle unlocked with a soft chirp. I opened the door and climbed into the driver's seat. Richard moved swiftly, sliding into the passenger seat beside me, keeping the gun trained squarely on my ribs. "Drive," he commanded, his eyes darting nervously around the empty parking garage. "Take the service exit, avoid the security cameras, head toward the industrial district in Queens. Do exactly what I say, or you die." I shifted the vehicle into drive and navigated toward the exit ramp. I kept my hands at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel, controlling my breathing. What Richard did not realize, what his alcohol-fueled panic prevented him from understanding, was that a tech CEO managing sensitive federal contracts does not travel without fail-safes. Before I ever stepped out of the elevator into the subterranean garage, I had initiated a silent distress protocol. Anticipating a potential physical ambush from the syndicate or the Harrisons, my cybersecurity team had engineered a custom emergency application on my smartphone. 3 rapid consecutive taps on the volume down button bypassed the lock screen and activated a highly encrypted continuous GPS beacon. That beacon was currently transmitting my exact coordinate speed and real-time audio directly to the DataSync Executive Security Command Center, and simultaneously to the FBI task force, monitoring me as a key witness in their racketeering investigation. I was not driving blindly into a hostage situation. I was leading an armed, unstable fugitive along a meticulously tracked digital tether. I drove in silence for 40 minutes, navigating the early morning traffic over the Queensboro Bridge, following Richard's erratic, paranoid directions. He guided me into a desolate, dilapidated industrial park near the waterfront. Abandoned warehouses with shattered windows lined the cracked asphalt road. It was an area completely devoid of civilian traffic, a graveyard of failed manufacturing businesses. "Pull into that alleyway," Richard ordered, gesturing with the barrel of the gun toward a narrow passage between 2 decaying brick structures. "Stop the car. Turn off the engine." I parked the SUV. The engine died, plunging the cabin into a heavy, oppressive silence. The sound of distant gulls and the low hum of the nearby highway emphasized our isolation. Richard reached into his jacket pocket with his free hand. He pulled out a crumpled, hastily printed legal document and threw it onto the center console. "Sign it!" Richard demanded, his breath coming in shallow, ragged bursts. I looked down at the document. It was a crude, desperate transfer of equity. The paperwork demanded the immediate, unconditional surrender of my entire controlling interest in DataSync to Richard Harrison. "You think this piece of paper holds any legal weight?" I asked, genuinely baffled by the sheer absurdity of his plan. "You are under federal indictment, Richard. The SEC has frozen your assets. A contract signed at gunpoint in an abandoned alleyway will not hold up in any court of law on earth. I am not taking it to a court." Richard spat saliva flying from his lips. "I am taking it to the syndicate. I will trade them the controlling shares of your company to erase my $15 million debt. I will use your assets to buy my life back. You ruined my family. You destroyed my legacy. You owe me your company, Sloane. Sign the paper, or I swear to God I will kill you right now." The threat was absolute. The safety was off. His finger twitched on the trigger. My life was suspended on the razor-thin edge of a desperate man's volatile temper. I reached for the pen resting in the center console. I picked it up slowly, uncapping it with deliberate, agonizing slowness. I needed to stall. I needed to keep him talking. The tactical units required time to establish a perimeter based on the GPS coordinates I was transmitting. I positioned the tip of the pen over the signature line. I did not write my name. I paused, looking over at the ruined patriarch of the Harrison Empire. "Let us examine the logic of your strategy." "Richard," I said, maintaining the calm, inquisitive tone of a consultant, auditing a flawed business model. "You plan to hand over $1 billion tech infrastructure to an underground lending syndicate operating out of the Diamond District." I watched his eyes narrow. He was confused by my refusal to panic. "Do you truly believe the syndicate wants the logistical headache of managing a corporate tech firm?" I asked, letting a cold, mocking smile touch the corners of my mouth. "They are loan sharks, Richard. They trade in liquid cash and physical coercion, not software development and server maintenance. If you walk into their headquarters and offer them a piece of paper instead of $15 million in liquid capital, they are not going to thank you." I leaned back slightly against the leather seat, keeping the pen poised above the document. "Do you honestly believe that stealing my company will make the syndicate forgive you?" I asked softly, letting the reality of his situation sink into his paranoid mind. "They do not care about data sync, Richard. They care that you lied to them. They care that you forged collateral to steal their money. Giving them this company will not save your life. It will just give them another reason to put a bullet in your head for wasting their time." Richard's face contorted in sheer impotent fury. He realized in that split second that his master plan was completely worthless. His final violent leverage meant absolutely nothing. "Shut up!" Richard roared, pressing the gun harder against my ribs. "Just sign the damn paper." I did not sign. I held the pen steady, listening closely to the ambient noise outside the vehicle. The distant sound of the highway had faded. It was replaced by a new, rapidly approaching sound. The low, heavy rumble of high-performance engines moving swiftly down the industrial road, running without sirens. The cavalry had arrived. The tip of my pen grazed the surface of the fraudulent contract. A single drop of dark ink bled into the cheap, unwatermarked paper. Richard leaned forward in the passenger seat, his bloodshot eyes fixed on the moving pen, his breathing ragged and shallow with desperate anticipation. He believed he had won. He believed that holding a loaded firearm to my ribs had successfully forced the surrender of a $100 million enterprise. He thought his sheer physical intimidation had overcome my digital defenses. He was incorrect. Before I could form the first letter of my signature, the heavy, oppressive silence of the abandoned industrial park shattered. A deafening mechanical roar echoed off the decaying brick walls of the alleyway. The rusted corrugated metal gate blocking the far end of the passage buckled, groaning under immense pressure before tearing wide open. An armored tactical response vehicle painted in matte black crashed through the barrier, sending jagged shards of metal sparking across the cracked asphalt. The piercing wail of federal sirens ripped through the air, an acoustic shockwave that vibrated deep in the teeth. Strobe lights radiating blinding red and blue flashes washed over the desolate corridor, illuminating the interior of my SUV with a harsh, frantic glare. Richard froze. The triumph on his face evaporated, replaced by a hollow, paralyzing terror. He tried to process the sudden invasion, his mind struggling to understand how a secluded location he had chosen at random was suddenly swarming with law enforcement. "Drop the weapon. Keep your hands visible." The command boomed from an amplified megaphone rattling the windows of my vehicle. Before Richard could even twitch his finger on the trigger, a dozen crimson laser sights pierced the shattered glass of the windshield. The glowing red dots tracked rapidly across the dashboard, settling in a concentrated lethal cluster directly over Richard's heart. The patriarch of the Harrison Empire stared down at his chest. The red lasers illuminated the cheap fabric of his jacket, marking him as the primary target of a federal tactical strike team. The illusion of his power dissolved in a fraction of a second. He was no longer a real estate tycoon holding a hostage. He was a desperate, armed fugitive, outnumbered by highly trained snipers, who were waiting for a single excuse to pull their triggers. His hands began to shake with violent, uncontrollable tremors. The heavy steel pistol slipped from his slick, sweating fingers. The weapon tumbled downward, striking the center console before clattering onto the floorboard near his feet. Move, move, move. The tactical officers swarmed the vehicle. Heavily armored agents flanked the passenger side. A steel baton smashed against the passenger window. The safety glass spiderwebbed and caved inward. Gloved hands reached through the broken window, grabbing Richard by the collar of his jacket and the shoulder of his shirt. They hauled the former billionaire out of the cabin with ruthless efficiency. I sat perfectly still in the driver's seat, watching the scene unfold with clinical detachment. I did not scream. I did not cower. I calmly placed the cap back onto my pen and dropped it into my purse. Through the missing window, I watched the agents throw Richard face down onto the freezing concrete. The harsh impact knocked the wind from his lungs. An officer drove a knee into the center of Richard's back, pinning him to the ground, while another wrenched his arms behind his back. The distinct metallic ratcheting sound of heavy-duty handcuffs locking into place echoed over the wailing sirens. An agent opened my door, offering a protective hand to help me out of the vehicle. I unbuckled my seatbelt and stepped out onto the damp pavement. I ignored the agent's outstretched hand. I looked down at my tailored trench coat, noticing a fine layer of glass dust clinging to the dark fabric. I raised my hand and methodically brushed the dust from my sleeve, restoring my immaculate appearance. I stepped around the shattered glass, walking deliberately past the trembling, handcuffed man pinned to the asphalt. But the execution of the Harrison legacy was not yet finished. The trap I engineered contained a secondary trigger, one designed to capture the final lingering threat to my existence. The screech of heavy tires tearing across the pavement cut through the noise of the idling armored vehicle. Two matte black luxury SUVs came skidding around the corner of the brick warehouse, blocking the sole exit route of the alleyway. The doors of the vehicles swung open before the tires had even stopped moving. Half a dozen men stepped out into the flashing red and blue lights. They wore dark, ill-fitting suits that stretched tightly across heavy, muscular frames. Thick, jagged tattoos crawled up their necks, visible in the harsh glare of the police strobes. It was the debt collectors from the shadow lending syndicate, the same enforcers who had placed a gasoline canister on my hood outside the restaurant. They had arrived to collect their $15 million. What the syndicate enforcers did not know was that they had not tracked Richard here through their own intelligence network. I had provided their navigation. 1 hour prior, as I left the DataSync headquarters, I sent an encrypted message to Malik. I instructed Malik to use a masked proxy server to leak my emergency GPS coordinates directly to the syndicate's primary broker. Malik sent a simple anonymous tip stating that Richard Harrison had kidnapped a wealthy tech executive and was currently liquidating her assets in an abandoned Queens warehouse to pay off the syndicate's debt. The loan sharks rushed to the location, desperate to intercept Richard and secure their stolen cash before he could flee the city. Blinded by their greed, they drove their entire collection crew directly into an active federal hostage rescue operation. The moment the syndicate men stepped out of their vehicles and recognized the FBI tactical armor, they froze. The federal agents pivoted instantly. The crimson laser sights shifted away from the handcuffed real estate tycoon and locked onto the chests of the armed enforcers. Federal agents, drop your weapons and get on the ground. The syndicate men were ruthless operators in the criminal underworld, but they were not foolish enough to engage in a firefight with a heavily armed SWAT division. The metallic clatter of unregistered firearms dropping to the pavement filled the alleyway. The enforcers raised their hands in silent surrender, sinking to their knees on the wet asphalt. Tactical officers moved in swiftly, kicking the weapons aside and securing zip ties around the wrists of the loan sharks. I stood near the hood of my vehicle, watching the dual arrest unfold with pristine clarity. With a single leaked coordinate, I had engineered the simultaneous capture of my corporate extortionist and the organized criminals hunting him. The predators had rushed the bait only to realize they were enclosed in the same cage. Richard Harrison twisted his neck, scraping his cheek against the unforgiving concrete to look down the alleyway. He watched the syndicate men being thrown against the side of their black SUVs and searched for weapons. He saw the federal agents documenting the scene. He looked back up at me, standing unbothered and immaculate in the center of the chaotic raid. The realization of his total, inescapable defeat finally penetrated his panicked mind. He realized that the frozen bank accounts, the digital firewall, the public humiliation at the Plaza, and the simultaneous arrest of his criminal lenders were not isolated incidents of bad luck. They were the calculated moves of a grandmaster maneuvering pieces on a board he did not even know existed. He had been outplayed on every conceivable level. "You are a demon, Sloane!" Richard screamed, his voice cracking with raw, unadulterated despair. His face contorted, tears of impotent rage streaming down his dirt-stained cheeks. "You planned all of this. You set us up to be slaughtered." I walked over to where he lay pinned against the ground. The flashing police strobes cast long, sharp shadows across my face. I crouched down slowly, bringing my face close to his, ensuring my voice would not carry to the federal agents securing the perimeter. I looked into his terrified, bloodshot eyes. I let a cold, genuine smile touch the corners of my mouth. "I am just a poor freelance web designer," Richard I whispered softly, keeping my tone light and conversational, as if we were discussing the weather over a cup of tea. "You are the one who wrote the script. I merely helped you finalize the ending." I stood back up, breaking eye contact. I turned my back on the ruined patriarch and walked toward the lead FBI agent to deliver my official statement. Behind me, Richard Harrison let out a long, hollow sob, a pathetic sound that was swallowed entirely by the wailing sirens. The final effort of my enemy had become the very noose that executed him. The architecture of my revenge was complete, and the stage was swept clean. 6 months elapsed since the raid in the industrial park. The federal courthouse in Lower Manhattan served as the final stage for the Harrison family's demise. I sat in the back row of the gallery wearing a tailored navy blazer, my hands folded neatly in my lap. I did not attend the sentencing to gloat. I attended to witness the closing of a ledger. The heavy wooden doors swung open, and federal marshals escorted Richard Harrison into the courtroom. The transformation was striking. The custom Italian suits and silk ties were gone, replaced by a standard-issued in prison uniform. His posture, once rigid with unearned arrogance, was broken. His shoulders slumped forward. His gray hair was thin and unkempt. The man who once commanded boardrooms and extorted his future daughter-in-law now shuffled toward the defense table with his wrists bound in heavy steel chains. Julian Harrison followed closely behind his father. Julian wept openly. Tears streamed down his pale, sunken cheeks. He kept his head bowed, unable to meet the gaze of the spectators sitting in the gallery. The confident heir who had shoved me against a wall and threatened my parents was reduced to a trembling shell. The federal judge struck the gavel against the sounding block. The sharp wooden crack echoed through the sterile room, signaling the end of an empire. The judge did not mince words. He detailed the extensive money laundering operation, the forged shadow loans, the attempted extortion, and the reckless endangerment of innocent lives. Richard Harrison received a sentence of 15 years in a federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole. The patriarch collapsed into his chair, burying his face in his chained hands as the reality of a decade and a half behind bars crushed him. Julian received a sentence of 8 years. He let out a hollow, agonizing sob, his legs giving out as the marshals hauled him back to his feet. I shifted my gaze across the center aisle. Patricia and Jessica sat in the first row of the gallery. They looked entirely unrecognizable. The federal government had seized the Westchester estate, the luxury vehicles, the offshore accounts, and the diamond jewelry they wore like armor. They were stripped of their wealth and their identity. Patricia wore a faded off-the-rack beige dress. Her roots showed stark gray against her dyed blonde hair. Jessica stared blankly ahead, her face devoid of the cruel, mocking sneer she wore at the engagement party. The bankruptcy courts showed them no mercy. The Harrison women were evicted from their high society circles overnight. The socialites who once attended their exclusive galas severed all contact. Patricia's phone stopped ringing. Jessica's invitations ceased. They were forced to vacate the city and move into a cramped, subsidized housing unit in a bleak neighborhood in New Jersey. I did not need to imagine their suffering. I saw the grim reality etched into their exhausted features. Patricia, a woman who once threw crystal goblets in Michelin-starred restaurants, now spent her days calculating grocery budgets and clipping coupons. Jessica, the arrogant heiress who poured wine on my silk blouse, was currently applying for entry-level administrative jobs. Every hiring manager who ran a simple internet search on her name immediately discarded her resume. The digital footprint of her family's criminal enterprise functioned as a permanent invisible prison. They were exiled from the only world they valued. The judge adjourned the court. The marshals led Richard and Julian away through a side door. Patricia and Jessica stood up slowly, clutching cheap faux leather handbags, and shuffled out of the courtroom. They walked right past the bench where I sat. They did not look at me. They kept their eyes fixed on the floor, carrying the heavy, suffocating weight of their permanent disgrace. I stood up, smoothed the lapels of my blazer, and walked out of the federal building into the bright, crisp New York afternoon. 1 hour later, I stepped out of my private elevator and walked into the executive suite on the top floor of the DataSync corporate headquarters. The atmosphere in my office was a stark contrast to the grim despair of the federal courthouse. Sunlight poured through the floor-to-ceiling glass windows, catching the sleek metallic surfaces of the boardroom table. The hum of a thriving secure technology firm vibrated through the walls. I walked over to my desk and poured a cup of hot Earl Grey tea from a porcelain teapot. The delicate clink of the ceramic cup grounding against the saucer was the only sound in the spacious room. The heavy glass door of my office swung open. Malik entered the room. Malik carried himself with a new, undeniable authority. The submissive, quiet posture he utilized to survive the Harrison family dinners was a relic of the past. He wore a sharp charcoal suit, moving with the precision and confidence of a man who knew his exact worth. When Malik handed over the explosive dossier that initiated the federal raid, he severed his ties with Jessica and walked away from their toxic lineage. I did not let a talent like Malik slip into the corporate void. The day after the press conference, I offered him a position worthy of his intellect. Malik was now the chief financial officer of DataSync. He walked up to my desk and placed a thick leather-bound financial portfolio on the polished mahogany surface. He tapped his index finger against the embossed cover. "I just finalized the quarterly earnings report," Sloane Malik stated, his dark eyes gleaming with quiet satisfaction. "We secured the 2 federal contracts we bid on last month. The market responded exceptionally well to our new security protocols. We are looking at a sustained revenue growth of 40% for this quarter alone." I picked up the portfolio and scanned the top sheet. The numbers were flawless. The upward trajectory of the company proved that shedding the Harrison contract and enduring the temporary media storm was the most profitable decision I ever made. Malik adjusted his tie, allowing a rare, genuine smile to break across his face. 40% growth in a single quarter, he mused, leaning against the edge of my desk. That is a rather impressive profit margin for a cheap gold digger working out of a Brooklyn apartment. I let out a sharp, genuine laugh. The sound echoed off the glass walls light and unburdened. The memory of Richard Harrison sliding that fraudulent prenuptial agreement across the table at Le Bernardin felt like a scene from a distant, grainy film. The insults they hurled at me, the wine they spilled on my clothes, the threats they whispered in dark rooms, it all dissolved into meaningless background noise. I raised my teacup, offering a mock toast to my chief financial officer. "We aim to exceed expectations, Malik." Malik nodded, returning the subtle gesture of respect. He turned and walked out of the office, heading back to his own suite to manage the rising tide of our corporate wealth. I turned my chair to face the sprawling expanse of the Manhattan skyline. The glass and steel towers glittered under the midday sun. Below me, the city moved in a chaotic, relentless rush. Millions of people chased power, chased money, and chased illusions. I took a slow sip of my tea, letting the warmth settle in my chest. A girl who was publicly humiliated at her own engagement party now controlled an empire from a glass tower. The Harrison family believed they could strip me of my dignity because I wore an off-the-rack dress and maintained a quiet demeanor. They mistook my silence for weakness. They mistook my patience for submission. They failed to realize that true power does not require a loud voice. It does not require thrown glasses, public screaming matches, or theatrical threats. True power relies on facts, documentation, and the lethal composure required to let your enemies dig their own graves. I did not hire a hitman. I did not engage in a petty smear campaign. I simply utilized the legal and financial systems they sought to exploit. I handed the authorities a mirror, forcing the Harrison family to look at their own reflection. Their greed, their arrogance, and their reliance on shadow networks engineered their downfall. I merely provided the coordinates for the execution. I set my teacup down on the saucer. I opened my laptop and typed in my administrative password, ready to review the next phase of our global expansion. I felt no lingering hatred toward Julian. I felt no resentment toward Richard or Patricia or Jessica. Hatred is a heavy, consuming emotion. It tethers you to the people who wronged you. I refused to grant them a single inch of real estate in my mind. I erased them from my life as efficiently as I deleted a corrupted file from a server. This was not an act of revenge. Revenge is chaotic, emotional, and unpredictable. What I accomplished over the last 6 months required precision strategy and unyielding discipline. It was a calculated restructuring of my environment. I looked at the reflection of my own face in the dark screen of the monitor. I saw a woman who refused to be a victim, a woman who controlled her own narrative and protected her own borders. That is not revenge. That is the art of arrangement. And I, Sloane Davis, am the architect of my own life. I often look down at the Manhattan streets from this glass office and think about the woman who sat in that private dining room at Le Bernardin. The woman they thought they could break with a spilled glass of wine and a fabricated contract. I did not survive the Harrison family by accident. I dismantled them through a series of deliberate choices, and looking back, the anatomy of their ruin offers a very clear blueprint. First, never confuse volume with authority. Richard and Patricia Harrison believed that because they shouted the loudest and wore the most expensive clothes, they controlled the narrative. But true power does not need to raise its voice. True power is written in ink, stored on encrypted drives, and backed by irrefutable data. When you face people who trade in intimidation and public humiliation, do not argue. Let them scream. Let them perform. While they waste their breath, quietly gather your receipts. Ironclad paperwork will always outlast a temper tantrum. Second, boundaries are not negotiations. When someone slides a threat across a table, whether it is a forged prenuptial agreement, a fabricated video, or a manipulative family demand, they are not asking for a compromise. They are revealing their true nature. Do not try to reason with predators, and never shrink yourself to accommodate their fragile egos. When toxic people establish ruthless rules of engagement, do not flinch. Simply adopt their rules and execute those same conditions against them with cold, clinical precision. Finally, understand the fundamental difference between revenge and architecture. Revenge requires you to carry the poison of hatred in your own veins. It keeps you emotionally tethered to the people who hurt you. Architecture is the act of removing your structural support from beneath their feet and letting gravity do the rest. I did not spend my energy hating Julian or Richard. I spent my energy building a fortress so impenetrable that when they tried to breach it, their own momentum broke their necks. Build your empire in silence and let your success become their permanent executioner. You do not owe toxic people your loyalty, your wealth, or your peace of mind. You owe yourself the courage to walk away and build a reality where they can no longer reach you. If my journey resonated with you, if you have ever had to quietly gather your strength to dismantle the bullies in your own life, drop a comment below and share your experience. I read every single one. Please hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications for Hazel Tells Stories. We explore the harsh realities of toxic dynamics, the necessity of setting ironclad boundaries, and the quiet satisfaction of ultimate justice. Thank you for listening, and remember, your silence